What is going on? It is Saturday, January 29th, 2022. We're inching closer to the very end of January, only 2 days left, and I am excited. I'm not sure why I'm excited, but I am excited. And as you can see on the screen, I have a picture of a neuron here in this search. So, yeah, I know I was supposed to talk about the blood, and I will get back to that. Maybe I'll get back to that. I'm wanting to jump around subjects a little. I don't know if that's always the best way to learn, but you really, um, have to practice a number of things before you get a real understanding of what the best techniques are to learn. And I really have been wanting to jump into neurochemistry, neurobiology, and neurobiochemistry for a bit, just to at least have the basics covered, because this is important. Even though this is the study of eternal life, this is where life is essentially, right? And where consciousness is within the brain. So I I've been wanting to take a detour into this for a long time, and I think this is probably the right time. I don't want to leave other things unfinished, but I do want to kind of get a holistic picture of a lot of different systems before jumping in to minutia from one's other specific system. So as far as the immune system is concerned, I'll definitely be jumping into some minutia there, in terms of the genetic minutia and whatnot. But I feel I want to cover a few different systems first to get a better idea of how everything connects together. That's really one of the important things to understand. Complementary pieces of systems, to understand this pieces, I can't, synonymous parts of systems, I guess that's the right way of saying it. Anyway, so I've rambled on a bit, so let's just get right into it. So I'm talking about the neurons, and this is going to be a very basic video on that, because there's quite a bit to talk about, but it's a relatively encapsulated system from a certain regard. So we can get through a lot of things pretty fast, at least the basic functioning of how neurons work and what they are, and the rest of the neurophysical system. So what you see here is a typical multipolar neuron. I'll get to the reason why it's a multipolar neuron in a bit, but what is it? It's a cell. It's just a standard brain cell, or one of your neuron cells, which with a standard component of the cell, which is the cell body here, called a soma, right, and which has a nucleus and has ribosomes and other standard cellular organelle components, right? So the neuron, what makes it different from other cells is that the neuron has dendrites on it. And these dendrites, and it has a few other things, but this neuron can communicate with other neurons, right, directly. And cells communicate all the time between each other through the release of cytokines and hormones and other things like that, as we've talked about in the case, for example, of the immune system. The T cells talk to the B cells, and through interleukins and other cytokines, and they get communicated to with other parts of from other parts of the system through those cytokines. So hormonal communication is one of the main parts of the communication mechanism of your body, but direct electrical stimulation is the other main part. And at some point I remember learning that direct electrical stimulation, I mean, it's instantaneous, right? It occurs much, much faster. I wouldn't say speed of light, because you have a lot of intermediate processes to go through to propagate the communication through your different cells, but it occurs as fast as possible within the body. So there's a point when hormones are needed, when communication is needed, but not as fast as possible. But in the case of neurons, through electrical signals, communication is needed as fast as possible, right? Like if you get inflicted, if you get hurt, right, or if you get an injury, you should feel that pain right away, right? You can't wait for hormones to propagate and then eventually be uptaken by cells, and thus the pain to register like 3 days later. Your body, evolutionarily speaking, needs to know right away when there's an issue, and therefore you have the neurons connected through their various electrical conductive electrically conductive pathways to everywhere in your body, your nerve cells, right? So that connection piece is essentially this part that's connected to the axon, right? And so these neurons, this long piece here, right, is the transmission channel of a neuron signal, right? That signal is called an action potential, which is something I'm sure everyone's heard of before. But it's the way that a neuron communicates electrically. So the action potential propagates through this long axon here, and it propagates in pieces. So part of the action, and there's many components to this propagation, but it doesn't all occur right away. It occurs through the movement of the exchange of sodium and potassium through this axon. Okay, so that's a little to get into, but I'll get into that later. But yeah, so this myelin sheath here, also something probably pretty well known, is something that protects the electrical signal from dissipating and kind of keeps the concentration constrained inside this sheath. These themselves are different cells, but these are like Schwann cells or glial cells, whatever you call it, and they allow the neurons to continue to propagate their information. Okay, so they're very important pieces of your cell. And then essentially at the other very important functional piece to talk about is at the axon terminal what happens, and that is called a synapse. Okay, so synapses essentially allow the communication between neurons once the signal is present at the terminal's axon. Okay, so these dendrites are connected through synapses from other unvisualized neurons here. And the synapses exchange neurotransmitters, which there are many, many different types of neurotransmitters, and it can get quite involved. But essentially what happens, an exchange of neurotransmitters occurs, and there, at that point, when the level of the chemical signal, electrochemical signal increases enough such that essentially the function of this thing boils down to simple: should it fire or should it not fire? And when enough axons are sending a signal through their neurotransmitters that they should fire, right? They stimulate the dendrites to take that information, sum it together somehow at this area called the axon hillock, which is not seen here, and then if a certain threshold is met, send a signal through to activate everything that's connected to the axon terminals of the particular neuron that sent the signal through, right? So you can see this is one in a huge network of neurons. Okay, so let's quickly go over the different kinds of neurons, right? Like there's bipolar, unipolar. There's all different kinds of neurons based on where the cell body is located, okay? And the structure of these neurons give kind of a hint as to what their purpose is, right? So for example, you have like bipolar neurons. You have your standard one is your multipolar neuron, which has a number of dendrites connected to it through and connected to other neurons through axons, and they just sum up the axons of adjacent neighboring neurons, and they just sum up the total potential and decide whether to fire or not based on that, chemically decide. Your pseudo-unipolar neurons and bipolar and unipolar neurons are essentially, they're not the same as your brain cells, they're sensory neurons, and so basically they deal with the propagation of a stimulus in a particular direction. Okay, so they're not really doing calculation, they're just controlling the signal and allowing it to propagate from one of your sensory systems, like your eyes or something like that. And they're much more rare within your body compared to your non-motor neurons or your standard neurons, like in your brain and your pain receptors. But it's important that they're there because they essentially connect to your CNS through your spine. That's kind of where the communication goes to your brain, and they have to be able to react instantaneously to stimulus. So that's the whole neuron polarity thing. So before I go, just a quick little jump to what's going on the actual chemical level, because now we know essentially at a high level how neurons work, and essentially that they propagate electrochemically somehow, a signal from one neuron to the neighbor through the axon connections and axon terminal connections via the synapses. But what is going on the more microscopic level is that you have an exchange of ions, right? So the other thing you've probably heard about is that neurons work because there's a voltage which is propagating somehow across the axon terminal, right? And so this long axon of varying lengths between different neurons has a bunch of these channels, sodium-potassium channels, embedded on the phospholipid bilayer, or the cell membrane of the neurons. Okay, so they have these sodium-potassium channels. They also have ATPase channels. They have many other types of channels, but these sodium-potassium channels are primary actors in allowing the electrical signal to propagate. And I think we'll go into probably next time a few of the details here, but at a high level, what they're trying to do is they're trying to balance the concentration of sodium and potassium on either side of the neuron in this part of the neuron. And that is done essentially because you can think of it like a wave, right? As you move the sodium and potassium into and outside of the sodium-potassium channels, and also the ATPase, which is not pictured here, then over the long course of the cell, this electrical charge will propagate. So you'll see kind of like a wave of electrical potential going from one end of the axon to the other, right? And you can imagine these sodiums and potassiums, they're going into and outside of a cell, and they're traveling back and forth and pushing the electrical signal along. So I think that's enough for now. That's quite a bit. We will talk later, and I hope you enjoy your day. See you around.